Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast for Monday, the 15th of May. I apologize for the technical difficulties that I may or may not be culpable regarding the later release of this episode. However, the importance of the subject is most likely made somewhat paramount in the title, and we are talking about self defense and the idea of an individual's right to self defense. This subject will continue to be of greater and greater importance in the 21st century as we are engaging in complicated, multifaceted problems that involve technology, the information past, things like doxing, things like swatting, and how the world that we live in is not nearly as simple as the thought experiments that we wish we could contain it in. However, we're going to engage in a series of those thought experiments as well as arguments related to the idea of the right of self defense and where it might be grounded in. That being the case, before we begin, this episode is going live on Monday the 15th. If you pre-order one of our shirts between today and the end of close of business, end of the clock on the 20th of May, you will automatically be entered into a giveaway for a Tour Knives mullet, which has very quickly become one of my favorite belt knives, especially in recent time where I've wanted to try to choose between things that I really enjoy the use of, its utility, as well as something that I'm going to hold on to for a little bit longer. That being the case, I've lost plenty of knives in places like the KG Valley and motorcycle accidents. So there was always a kind of a give and take. But there are also two other ways you can enter into the giveaway. You can head over to our Instagram. And there is a self-explanatory post where if you want to enter and get free entries for the giveaway, head over there to Instagram and tag people who you think badly need a good belt knife. Every tag or every comment is considered an entry, and go ahead and fill that up as far as you want to go. The second thing you can do is you can head over to our website, redactedllc.com. There will be a pop-up, but we will also there's a tab on the top and the bottom that says Dead Drop. Dead Drop is going to be the name of our newsletter. So if you sign up for our newsletter, which is going to be the most efficient way we can maintain contact with you about upcoming events, releases, and material, content, guests, and so forth. The newsletter is how we reach out to you. The locals page is how we build a little bit of communication between each other. You can also write us. You can write me here at Redacted LLC, and the address is going to be 30633, I'm sorry, P.O. Box 30633, Tucson, Arizona 85751. If you write me a letter, I will do my best to write you one back. So let's get into the hard target of the hard material, the subject. We're talking about this idea of self-defense, and there are a number of current events that have resumed this subject into the social discourse. And as usual, if you don't need to look very far to get some of the world's worst takes. There was an event that took place in New York City on the subway where a former Marine whose name is Mr. Penny, who has been charged by the district attorney Alvin Bragg with second-degree manslaughter for the events that led to the death of a certain Mr. Neely. And there is a resumed question on whether or not the actions took place were morally justified. According to some accounts, the event that took place was a man was threatening violence on a form of public transport, and multiple people sought to restrain him after he began allegedly acting more and more dangerous, including threatening life and bodily harm, as well as including statements like I'm not afraid of going back to jail. Again, whether the mental health of this individual is in question, but what ended up happening is he was restrained in what is being called a chokehold, and he expired. So why would an event like this, which is, I mean, the event itself is a very political event. Although people may be aware of it before, I want to make sure that Tim Pool gets some credit for, even as he says, being late to the party. I think he made a statement recently about he had become cynical of sorts, maybe black-pilled in the cultural context towards the outcome of this court case, and has recently changed his mind, which is something that I think is encouraging in the sense that whether or not he chose to make a financial contribution to what is understood as the defense case for this individual. He also changed his tune drastically from a rather cynical and brutal approach, saying, well, you live in New York City, you kind of get what you get. It's a paraphrase, and it's not a very good one. He changed his tune, saying, no, we should even still stand up for people in unfortunate situations who do the right thing, if that is the right thing that they've done, or at least be able to defend themselves in court. That being the case, and that being what we're saying here, the question gets brought up again about on what grounds do we justify the concept of self-defense? And the last 3 years, if anything, have shown that what the assumptions that we made about what we thought our culture held as values and virtues in regards to self-defense really just isn't the case. Whether we talk about things like Kyle Rittenhouse or other events that have taken place post-riot, during riot, United States, what we recognize is that our fellow man does not necessarily believe the same things that we do when it comes to the right of self-defense. But even though we are able to identify that what they believe is different than what we believe, are we really all that capable of identifying very specifically what it is that we ourselves believe? And since I cannot necessarily speak on your behalf, I'm going to start unpacking some of the foundations by which I understand the idea of, or what the idea or the right of self-defense would be grounded in. One of the references that I'm going to be using today is a very useful tool. It's a useful publicly available resource, and that is the Stanford. Let's see, the Standford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There you go on the headline there. This is a useful tool, a useful website because of the density of the material presented. It may not always be one about conclusions that we enjoy or agree with, but the density, the intellectual density of the subject, not dense as in silly, you silly goose, but rather it's useful for engaging in difficult subjects because of the amount of material presented on its page. It takes deliberate reading. I wouldn't necessarily describe most of these articles, these entries, which are in some sense peer-reviewed quite well, as easy reading, but they're still worth reading. And we're just going to be covering the top section here: one, liability justifications, liability and causation, and then getting into the concepts of culpability, causal relationships, and responsibility. So let's begin. On what basis does an individual have this idea of the right to self-defense? On what basis at all, what foundation, by what standard would a person be able to claim that they have a right to self-defense? On its nose, the question is a little bit absurd. It's absurd because outside of any sort of scenario that isn't purely, let's just say, I don't know, purely like inquisitive, it makes rather clear sense. We don't really engage in long form debates and discussions and thoughts very often on fictional characters' use of self-defense in movies and television. We also listen to stories, read books, and so long. And when we understand a person's motivations for motivations for violence, we don't always clarify the distinction between their motivations and it being justified. But that is a useful place to start. And the idea that a person's right to self-defense could be challenged might honestly uh, exist in a world where, or the question itself might exist in a world that requires a series of assumptions that we don't necessarily hold. An example would be something like, does a person have a right to self-defense, or does a person have a right to life? And these kinds of questions these answers to these questions get fleshed out in many ways in how we answer, you could call them subcutaneous questions, if you wanted to add another 50-cent word to your lexicon. Subcutaneous, under the skin. But even after decades of considering the question of where is the right to self-defense located, it isn't necessarily easily found. In fact, we recognize, due to the extreme moral weight of the subject, that it is a difficult question. And for that, I encourage you as an individual. In fact, I implore you. I commend you for the rigorous and the rigorous pursuit of knowledge in regards to this right, while it's mixed in with a good dose of humility. I think it takes a certain amount of humility to even consider the question in a reasonable format. But the first place that I will begin when it comes to the right to self-defense will, on the one hand, be considered a biblical question. A person has a right to self-defense because an attack against a human being is effectively, ultimately, and in the long form, an attack against God, because it is an attack against the creation of God, and it is an attack against something that is created in the image of God. This is illuminated in the early parts of the Bible, particularly where we hear about Cain and Abel. When Abel kills Cain, God does not come down and have a conversation with Cain. Or, I'm sorry, when Cain kills Abel, geez, that was a slip of the decade, a slip of the, whatever you want to call it, ad infinitum. But when Cain kills Abel, God does not come to him and say, "Oh, you violated Abel's rights." What God says to Abel or Cain is that he says, you've struck out against me. You've killed something that was created in my image. And so there is something about, and in some way, an act of a right to self-defense would be a duty-bound responsibility to defend that which was created in the image of God. But that even there identifies the nuance of what the Bible implies in morality. And this nuance is brought out even later in the Bible in the words of Jesus in the book of Matthew, where Jesus makes the statement, if you even hate your brother, you have effectively committed murder in your heart. And so the acts of self-defense also, regardless of the scenarios presented in this position, require that not only is the person intentionally defending their lives, but they're defending their lives for the right person. However, in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, whatever you want to call it, in the world that we live in, which is diminished, or our intellects are diminished by sin, and in the world that we live in, where we have multiple different cultures, of opinions, and foundations, saying that it is justified because of a person's heart was right before God doesn't stick very well in court, especially if the person who is responsible for overseeing the case has a bone to pick against you or God. But the right to self-defense in this illumination begins from the right that in fact, maybe even the responsibility of an individual to defend things that defend God, in a sense, against, not defend God as in you're defending his well-being, but defend things that are holy, set apart, or in his image, against those who seek to destroy it. It also implies that a person's desire to cause pain, suffering, and death is involved in the equation. Now, it's convenient when we have a very, very distinct case where the person wants to do evil for evil's sake, and he is stopped by somebody who wants to do good for good's sake. But again, we live in a world that's so much more complicated than that, which is thus where the conversation about rights sort of evolved, especially during the eras of the Enlightenment and so forth. The Enlightenment eras, especially the writing of John Locke, which is most often quoted in this subject and is worthy of reading, and I admit that I have not read it thoroughly enough to have let's just say, a resolute position on all or any of Locke's writings, although I have interacted with it quite a bit through excerpts, sections, and illustrations of his work. He does imply that there's this idea of rights. He does imply that there's this idea of rights that we have by virtue of being mankind. And from that conversation, it is not uncommon for someone to encounter something like, when a person violates another, or seeks to violate another person's right, that person has a right to essentially void their life. If I seek to end your life, you have a right to void mine. It's very let's dig into it. Let's actually go let's go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The starting element says self-defense, published Tuesday, January 29th, 2021. Killing and harming others are pragmatic wrongs. Interesting assumption there. Maybe I would disagree, probably actually, but let's move on. Yet there is at least one intuitive exception to this prohibition, namely killing or harming in self-defense or in the defense of others. Consider murder. An attacker is culpably trying to kill a victim because he is jealous of victim's success. The victim then can save his own life by lethally throwing a grenade at the attacker. So I am reading directly from, for those who are listening, I'm reading directly from the Standford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And so if even with a light sense of humor, you'll kind of laugh at, well, a man is attacking another person out of jealousy, and the victim can save his own life by throwing a grenade. Well, that they decide. Yeah, what country are you in, and why aren't you sharing? But with the exception of strict pacifists, I'm continuing to read on here. With the exception of strict pacifists, there is a broad consensus in morality and law that defensive harm can be permissible in cases like this. However, as we shall see, it is surprisingly difficult to explain the grounds and limits of this permission. So, what the Stanford Encyclopedia has already begun with is this idea that what the Stanford Encyclopedia has already begun with is that in very simple cases, very simple thought experiments, it's rather obvious that he's justified, that a person seeking to do something murderous, it is the right of the individual. Now they're making a claim that it's true. Maybe we need to figure out the claim of why it's true or how it's true to go a little bit further. Let me restate that one more time, and let's bring this up one more time. The up at here at the top, killing and harming others are pragmatic wrongs, and yet there is at least one intuitive exception to this prohibition, namely killing or harming in self-defense or in the defense of others. Consider. So they make this consideration. They're not necessarily making it a claim. But then in the example, the attacker is culpably trying to kill victim because he is jealous of the victim's success. In other words, the attacker is intending to do harm or serious bodily harm or cause death to the victim for an immoral reason, a unjustified reason, more specifically. So because his attack is unjustified, the victim can save his own life by lethally throwing a grenade at the attacker. This example is as it's described, is intuitive, but let's ask the question of why. Let's ask the question of why it's intuitive, or how do we come to this? Where is this intuition grounded in? And we start to engage in questions of, well, where does the right to self-defense come from? And what are the limits of that right to self-defense? The argument, I think, that where it can begin with in regards to rights begins with something like this. It almost harkens back to Descartes, cognito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. And perhaps the first most basic right that a conscious human being has is the right to their own thoughts. What I mean by the right to their own thoughts is that any force used to any force used, invasive method, force used to rule the individual's thoughts is itself an infringement of this idea. What I mean by this is, if someone could create a device, a hat, let's call it a hat, a mind control hat. Would a mind control hat be a violation of the individual's rights? The answer, I think, is yes, because you have the right to think what you think. You may be wrong. You're not required. You do not have a right to the world reality bending itself to your idea of what is true, but you have the right to genuine thought. That means that no one gets to tell you what you think, insofar as no one gets to dictate your thought. And your thought the extension of your thought is your actions, and the extent of your actions is, well, in some ways, the consequences. But you could start by thoughts, then go to words, then go to deeds. And this is illuminated in a certain part of the First and Second Amendment of you have a right to religious freedom, which is in a sense the deepest, the most solid form of thought that an individual can have, because a religious belief is when accurately understood, is a conjunction of the mind and the heart in this subject. It is something that is one genuinely believed and intellectually considered. The 1990s Sam Harris version of what religion is this sort of belief of a pie in the sky creation or concept, is not only just a seriously diminished one, and I'm not representing it well, so I apologize to Sam Harris fans. I'm not representing it well, and I need to do a better job at that. But this idea that belief in God or a religious belief is simply a belief in some sort of supernatural entity is a severely childish, naive idea of what religion actually is. And so the core thing that an individual has in regards to rights, the deepest right, perhaps the most foundational right a person has, is a right to religious freedom, religion, in believing what they believe and having that have some efficacious um, consequence in his life, while those actions may also have consequences outside of that. For example, you can't just believe that you're a cannibal and then be justified in cannibalism. But that core belief comes from something. And while historians, and especially people on the right, like to say that that came from Christianity, there is a certain solvency, there's a certain consistency to that argument. But let's not just stop there at the politics. Let's continue this project forward. From thoughts, a person has a right to speech, because speech is your most, let's see, the speech is sort of like the most basic form of interaction in the world in regards to conscious peoples. We talk before we fight, or at least we should talk before we fight. It is, in the escalation of force, the lowest level of force that exists. In fact, if speech is violence, if we're gonna play with the joke that speech is violence, there is a certain amount of it that makes sense, because oftentimes speech threats become violence, or they allude to and they identify the potentiality of violence, but they are themselves not violent alone. You may consider them violent if you're so weak and frail, but we're not going to get into any further ad hominems. Apologies on my end. And so from the beginning, we have a right to our belief, and then we have a right to our thoughts, and then we have a right to our speech, and all of those things will continue if we follow that logical pipeline to a right to self-defense. Because if I have a right to defend my thoughts, so to speak, and I have I have a right to my thoughts, that means any attempt to violate that is something that I need to be able to push back from, because a right without a responsibility, or a right without any sort of a right without a responsibility is not a right at all, and a responsibility without some method of applying it is another form of a trap. It's another fallacy of some sorts. If I have responsibility, I have to be able to act efficaciously in the subject. And so we go from rights of the individual to belief, because that's the single most ultimate event, that single most ultimate consequence in an individual's life. And then from there we have thoughts, and then from there we have speech, and from there we have actions. So a right to self-determination can come from cognito ergo sum. If you want to understand where that comes from, just a little side note, it is Meditations on First Philosophy by Rene Descartes. It is an old book, but it is also, in essence, part of the inspiration for The Matrix. Enjoy reading that. So this is where I think that this is where I'm going to make the argument that that's where the right to self-defense comes from, at least from on the one hand, mostly from a Christian. I believe that it's solely dependent on a Christian standpoint. But if somehow you can get to a person has a right to their thoughts without having some sort of or some sort of Christian foundation, then there you go. I'm trying to give you something to work with. However, be advised, I don't believe you can necessarily I don't think you can actually get there without there being some sort of first mover, some sort of ontological cause for morality. moving on. So now we have covered a series, we have covered just the foundation, the beginning of what a right to self-defense looks like. But now we have to deal with the really hard part. We're going to move through this at a pace that we're going to just move through this. We're going to get right into it. Right to self-defense. Now we have questions on liability. There are different ways that that we can engage in difficult thought problems regarding the ideas of self-defense, like when is it justified and when is it not justified, when is it moral and when is it immoral, and 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 Stanford begins with this statement on liability justifications. On a standard view, the moral wrongness of killing and injuring is grounded in a person's having stringent moral rights against such treatment. In other words, by my being alive, I bear a right that you have that implies an obligation on you, not which is a negative obligation, not to infringe on that right to life. By being alive, I have a right to life, and if you try to alter that, if you are trying to take away my life, you are infringing on my right in a sense, which then gives me grounds by which I could perform self-defense. But what happens when the events that lead to self-defense, the events that lead to the scenario are not actually caused by a malicious intent? What happens, for example, with the runaway trolley? And this is that argument of a runaway trolley is lethally heading towards 5 innocent people. A bystander, an engineer, can divert the trolley away from the 5 on a sidetrack, but the diverted trolley will kill a workman. This is Thompson, 1985, based on a case in Foot 1967. Another valuable piece of material that comes from the Standford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is that you can get footnotes as to where these ideas come from. The further you read, you'll find that sometimes the writing style of the original author is hard to consume, but still, it's worth it. We have this idea in the liability versus lesser evil justifications. The idea of a lesser evil is it is less a lesser evil scenario would be some form of, in fact, a relic of utilitarianism. The idea of the trolley case is that less evil will be done by killing the workman, but it will require the conscious effort of the individual. Now we're starting to look at, well, this is not really self-defense, though. The question would be, maybe a more accurate trolley question would be, a man is tied to a train, or a man is tied to a track, and there is a trolley rushing towards him, but he has access to a remote control that will divert the trolley, but it will cause the death of one or any number of other people who are innocent. Is he morally justified in pressing the button? That is where the question gets very difficult. I think with the trolley problem, as it's traditionally presented, a runaway train is lethally heading towards 5 innocent people. A bystander engineer can divert the trolley away from 5 down a sidetrack. The diverted trolley will kill a workman. That one is a very difficult question, but it's easily bogged down in, or it's also in a good example of how people reveal what they believe by how they answer the question. If he says no, then that person believes that he is not justified in picking and choosing who lives. And then if the person says yes, he is in some sense a utilitarian, saying it is better that 1 die and 5 live than 5 die and 1 live. But the problem is that he's not necessarily causing the death of the workman in a culpability way, to the extent that he didn't start the train. But then that's whole nother argument of, well, you're only partially culpable, and then how culpable are you? How responsible are you? Let's let that one go for now, because I don't even know if I have a really good answer for the trolley problem, as if I don't know if there's a solution for it. Maybe what happens if he throws himself in front of the trolley and it stops the trolley? But from a lesser evil angle, the problem that we have with the lesser evil one is that somewhere in that dilemma, we are describing that there is ascribed value to individuals. And I think one of the ways where the lesser evil justification tends to go awry is in racism. There is there is this issue with the idea of racism, in the sense of it ascribes different value to people's lives. The famous, was it 3/5 rule or something like that? I know that's probably it's a very dismissive way of addressing a rather morally heinous description, but let's move right into it. Um, the one thing that we can come from this conclusion, one thing that we can gain from this thought experiment, is understanding that people's individual human rights are equal, or people's human value is equal from person to person to person. And so if you were to build a ethical system that determined the rights that an individual has by, say, their skin color, you would be producing a necessarily immoral scenario. And this is interesting too, because in this case of the world that we live in right now, there is something to be claimed about a people's right to self-defense not being determined by skin color. That does not, however, completely translate to anyone who brings this up is doing so honestly. And you might run into a case like what's going on in New York, where the accusation is that the decision, or the accusations that are being chosen are in some ways and shapes being motivated by um, skin color, or maybe by political means. This is an ugly topic, but it needs to be approached. If we were to find a way, pardon the squeak of the voice, I'm running out of this again. More liquid death, good times. In the would it is it too soon to be like not sponsored? Sorry. By that's a Lucas Botkin thing, T-Rex arms thing. But if if we come to this conclusion, if we're going to address the problem of human life, we have to begin. We will immediately, or we will ultimately be deciding on coming to this conclusion of questioning what do we actually believe about individuals' rights as far as in correlation to their physical appearance or who they are as people. The old racist idea is that some people have rights and some people don't. And the thing that determines their position of rights would be their skin color. Maybe one could make the accusation that the individual who used a chokehold in New York City is being treated as if he doesn't have a right to self-defense on the basis of his skin color. And if that conclusion were to be made and solidified, then the person who is holding that position stands on a very, very, very immoral position. The person who believes that Mr. Penny does not have a right to self-defense on the basis of his skin color, well, that person is something that we would call a racist. And in being racist is immoral, because it is immoral for multiple reasons, but we don't need to get into that now. But it also doesn't change from person to person. Old man, young woman, old woman, young man. A person has a right to self-defense on the basis that they are a person. And the liability, or the lesser evil justification, has a really hard time with quantifying what is lesser evil. And the same thing goes for utilitarianism, is it has a very hard time quantifying what is considered moral on the base of its utility, its outcome. Utilitarianism is not like utility knives. We know this. And so what we get from there, though, is there almost becomes immediately resounding from the heavens the question of by what standard? By what standard are you determining the value of individuals, and what outcome would you say? Is it justified for that one may die so that 99 may live, even if that death is not voluntary? We would call that murder. So the answer kind of comes down to no. It becomes very difficult, but what we do know, and what we can conclude from this position, is that a person's right to self-defense is not determined by their skin color. Liability, though, so liability is focused more on defending against murder, as well as, let's go back to Stanford over here, a liability model having to do with, we got to scroll down, grounds of liability. One of the key questions in the literature on defense of harm concerns the conditions under which a person is liable. It is helpful to distinguish two areas of this debate. The first focuses on the relevance of, if any, facts about the individual's agency, such as their beliefs, evidence, intentions, culpability, and degree of moral responsibility. The second focuses on the relevance, if any, of causal relations between an individual and a threat of harm. In this subsection, we will canvass some of the main positions on the agential conditions of liability. For the ease of exposition, we will focus on causally straightforward cases in which the individual poses a direct threat to others. We will consider the causation debate in 1.3. So the culpability side of this one. There's one example that was brought up by McMahon, 2005, and this is a driver who always drives carefully and keeps her car well maintained faultlessly loses control of her car. She will hit and kill a victim unless the victim blows up the car and the driver with a grenade. Once again, Stanford's obsession with grenades in this article is hilarious. So now, does that individual have a right to self-defense? The person, the otherwise victim, I mean, I guess calling him a victim is kind of the more like the, well, I guess it could, um, but the victim of it is a, the idea of the victimhood of this scenario is a little bit kind of odd, right? Because we have, what happens if, does the individual who is going to be hit by the car have the right to defend herself, even though it'll cost the life of the driver? And on what basis? And I think the answer to this one is, well, yeah, I mean, yes, they do, but then the question is on what grounds? Maybe it's because they cannot determine, that person has a right to self-defense because they're incapable of determining, and we mean reasonably incapable, not because they've chosen to be stupid, but reasonably incapable of understanding the intent of the driver. Maybe they'll give it a shot, maybe not. And there's another example that's presented by Nozick. Nozick, if you've been listening to the show for a while, I mentioned Nozick in reference to a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which is a very good book to read. Again, technical but valuable. And he goes, a falling person is helplessly blown by the wind down a well at the bottom of which a victim is trapped. The falling person will crush the victim to death unless the victim vaporizes her with his ray gun. If he does not vaporize her, the falling person will survive her fall. So, in other words, the moral question of this thought experiment is basically paralleling two options. You will have the person, by no fault of their own, falls down a well. If nothing changes, they will survive, but the person who is at the bottom of the well will die. If the person at the bottom of the well uses a ray gun to vaporize the falling person, they will survive, but at the cost of the life of the individual falling. Is this a self-defense case? Yes, it's a self-defense case because the person is technically defending themselves. Is it justified? Probably. I think the answer is yes. It's a justified case. They're defending their life. Is it moral? That is where we get a much more difficult question. Effectively, I think the question is, yes, the answer is moral, but it is also tragic. In both of these cases, the conscientious driver who by no fault of her own loses control of her car, there is a response that's made by choosing to drive a car. She is accepting the moral responsibility that there's a potential of a negative outcome. Oh, I didn't even have that up. Oh, bam. The conscientious driver bears some sort of moral responsibility because she chose to drive her car. Whereas the second case, the person didn't choose to accidentally fall down the well, and they didn't choose to trip, and they didn't, like they chose to walk. Like, okay, fine. They choose to exist, continue. They chose to continue existing. So these questions really do hearken into the situations of self-defense that come down to scenarios which could be described as moral but tragic. It is tragic that the person, by no fault of their own, loses their life because the person defending their life is by no means doing so out of entrapment. We have to rule out a series of things. They're not entrapping the other person. They're not setting up a scenario where they get to defend their lives, even though they actually had some causal agency and they had some agency and some causal nature to setting up the scenario. For example, if we have the conscientious driver problem, if the person defending their lives were to cut the brake lines, then yeah, they would be technically defending their life, but they would also technically, really much more specifically, they would be setting themselves, they wouldn't be defending their life by the fact that they caused the event to take place. Whereas the other one, there is, you could try to find some sort of thought experiment where the person in the well sets up the scenario where the other person will trip, and then he at the bottom of the well has to use their ray gun to save their own life at the cost of the others. But then again, we get a little bit deeper into it. We start dealing with questions of culpability, causal responsibilities, and then or causal relationships and moral responsibility. And culpability states that a person is liable for posing an unjust threat only if they are blameworthy or otherwise open to moral criticism for doing so. This is another excerpt from the Standford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it's making a claim that a person is liable. They are responsible for their own death when they unjustly threaten or pose an unjustly threat against somebody else, and they do so in a blameworthy fashion or a morally culpable fashion. They're responsible for their choice. In other words, a person who breaks into your house and attempts to kill you is effectively responsible for their own death because they chose to break into your house and kill you. This would mean that a person on a public transit system who goes about threatening people's lives is effectively responsible for his own death by the nature that he voided other people's he made himself liable for his own death because he chose to attack or pose an attack to other people. Maybe not even pose an attack. He threatened other people's lives and therefore therefore became liable for the outcome of said actions. Now, on the face of this seems pretty reasonable. It seems on the face of it, if I put you in a scenario where you have to defend your life against me, I bear responsibility for my own death. You could even say something like suicide by cop. This position, not this position, but this explanation, this scenario does add context and flavor to what we're talking about, because with the liability of a person becoming liable because they are initiating the scenario, is where we start to understand how self-defense works. Is that I have a right to preserve my life, and you put me in a scenario deliberately without my intent, put me in a scenario where I have to, in order to preserve my life and yours. That would be a justified example of self-defense. But then there's also the causal one, which would be this has to do with a little bit more of the language about a victim's right not to be harmed. So I have a right, let's just say, let's use this language of an individual having a right not to be harmed. I have a right of sovereignty over my body. That means I have a right by nature of existing and being a human being to seek after the well-being of my body. Now, if I encounter a scenario where the well-being of my existence is threatened, I have a right to self-defense. I have a right not to be harmed. But we've heard this language before in other scenarios, most specifically in the idea that the value of a human life is not the same as the value of a human life is greater than the value of property. And the response that's given to this question is oftentimes something like this: time is labor. Labor is effectively an extension of your individual. That which you produce by your own labor and time is your property because it is an extension of what you have produced with your own hands. Therefore, when I go to work and I make $20 and I buy something for $20, I am exchanging my labor, time, and being for a thing which is effectively mine in the sense of property. And if you steal from me, you are stealing a part of my life, in effect doing harm to somebody that could amount to the question of threat of death or bodily harm. But what that does then is that ultimately creates a big problem, because it tends to either have to be ultimate, like and there's certain things that we don't agree with, like for example, if you try to steal my sandwich, I can't just blast you. But it also starts to kind of ask the question of, at what dollar value does it become relevant? Because on the one hand of this thought experiment, I have a sandwich. and somebody decides that they are going to threaten to kill me, or they're not going to threaten to kill me. No, I have a sandwich and somebody tries to steal that sandwich. Am I justified in using lethal force to defend my property? Well, I think we're going to assume no, but why? Now let's take that example and let's change it. I own a wheat field in which the wheat that will be grown in that field will be the food that I use to survive the winter. And you decide to steal the wheat from that field. And the cause of you stealing that wheat will be the death of me. Will potentially be the death of me. I might maybe I have insurance on that wheat. Sure. But now what you're doing then is we have two examples here. We have the Aladdin thief, the I just needed a sandwich so I didn't, I can survive thing, which they're essentially relying on your compassion, and it's pretty rude and beyond. But on the one hand, we have that one, and on the other hand, we have the communist problem of, well, we need to serve the hordes, so we're going to steal your wheat. You don't have a right to your outcomes, and so on and so forth. You don't have a right to the outcome of your labor. You don't have a right to your property. And centered on both of those is oftentimes this regularly occurring conversation about how, well, the work that I put into is part of my life. I'm giving up a part of my life by time or by effort or by energy or by health. Imagine you're a guy who works on an oil rig, or you're working, in a situation that's extremely perilous, and in exchange for volunteering for this very perilous position, you are paid money, and that money is used to pay for your home. And when you get in your vehicle or whatever it is, and when you are home, someone tries to steal that vehicle from you. um, are you justified in self-defense? If you are able to somehow divine, and this is where the question always gets muddy, if you're able to somehow divine the intent of the attacker, would you be justified in self-defense? That if you could somehow look into their mind, Proverbs says no man knows the mind of another, but if you were to somehow dig into their mind and identify that they had no intention to do harm, they just wanted your car, would you be justified in using self-defense? And I think the answer is yes. We just don't exactly have a flat out line. There is really no monetary value on it. And so in some sense, if a person is lunging for you to steal your sandwich, and you have to use violence in self-defense, and it causes them to die, to some extent you might make the argument that, well, I didn't know that he was only going for my sandwich, and that can be true. But it also gets even muddier, but we still are trying to seek out answers. The the initial answer and the initial problem is that when it comes to the difference in value of property versus people lives, we run into nearly infinite number of factors in order to solve the question, and it becomes almost a case basis, which is why I think the value of the jury of our peers was initially imposed, because people would have sociocultural context to the events of the scenario. It wouldn't be determined by an arbitrary judge in a different country. Because you have to ask questions of, like, well, what happens to the person is stealing a family heirloom? Like, for example, if you if you have a religious belief that is genuine in its foundation, that the the soul of your grandfather must be preserved in an urn for 10 years above the mantle, and someone comes in specifically to steal that urn, even though it has no monetary value, but it's an heirloom, are you justified in using self-defense? And it goes mad. So I know that I have not necessarily made it easier to begin with. We've actually had to make it quite a bit difficult, because we recognize that. And to be clear, I don't think you can really honestly answer all of these complicated questions in a single episode of this podcast, which is why we're going to revisit this topic from time to time. But what we're running into is we have at least come to determine a few things. One of them is, if there is a right to self-defense, it is not determined by the immutable characteristics of the individual. It cannot be determined by skin color, or whatever people want to call race or gender, right? These are immutable characteristics. A person has a right because they're a person, not because they are a black person or a white person, whatever that means in 2023. Rather, the right to self-defense is grounded in the fact that you are a person. The second thing that we can come into conclusion is that, to some extent, and I know that some people, critics will probably glaze over this with eye rolls, but that the idea that that property is not as value as a person's life is at least morally suspect. It's not so simple. And I think the appropriate response to that is that though many people ask that question or posit that challenge, they're A, not at all, in any way, shape, or form interested in the answer, and B, using that as a smokescreen. This is the in defense of looting smokescreen. This is the idea that people have, well, maybe not, I can't use in defense of looting, but I can use another one, is that an individual's property, stealing somebody's property, or even a corporation's property for that matter, is not justified, or is justified because, I'm sorry, I butchered that whole idea. I completely butchered that whole explanation. Rather, the conclusion being, it is not the case that property is worth the same as a person's human life, but that is posing the question incorrectly. First of all, the person doesn't have an individual defending their life does not necessarily or realistically have this ability to divinely understand what a person's intentions are. If I have my hands in my pockets and I am threatening to kill you, then you reasonably have to make the assessment, and it's a difficult assessment, but by being in that scenario, that responsibility is up to you to decide whether or not the threat is legitimate, and there is an appropriateness to it. This idea of simple justification just is not very easily sticking in the real world. It tends to work really well in very obvious cases, but not very well in ambiguous cases. The third thing that we can take away from this one, and kind of we're just illuminating introductory parts, is that I'm sorry, and the third thing that we're going to try to take away from this one is that the idea of the right to self-defense does in some way come from this idea of the right to self-preservation and the right to self-sovereignty. And that includes negative and positive rights, primarily negative rights, in that you have an obligation not to void another person's right to life. However, that does not necessarily translate one-to-one that a person has a right to life that supersedes your right to property. Ergo, the gun control argument that I have a right to not be afraid for my life. No, you don't. I mean, not be afraid. Okay, well, that is a subjective standard. So it's not a standard at all. But I have a right to safety. No, you have a right to sovereignty. And if people infringe on that sovereignty by trying to kill you, you have a right to self-defense. But you don't have a right to preemptive self-defense. And we're going to start talking about preemptive strikes in the future, because that is another topic that gets very, very complicated very quickly. But we've also understood that something in simple scenarios where a person maliciously intends to do you harm, you have a right to defend yourself. We also have less clear scenarios, which is those kind of scenarios where it's not clear that the person who's attacking is intentional. This is the car that's lost control, the person falling down the well, the ray gun kind of examples. Again, Robert Nozick. In conclusion, in finality of this one, it's important that we recognize that this idea of self-defense is actually something that cannot be legislated. You can only legislate the consequences of an individual's choice to defend themselves. If the world were to get so tyrannical that someone could plant a chip in your brain that stopped you from thinking and thus acting in your own self-preservation, the act of that alone would be immoral. It doesn't matter what the outcome would be. That alone would be immoral, because then your right to your thought and your sovereignty would be void. And because a right to self-defense is in this sense, God-given right, it's a natural right, there is no way that it can actually be taken from you. The social contract has some problems with it. where and the social contracts has some theory, has some difficulties dealing with it, but this is why, for example, felons don't necessarily do they not have a right to self-defense? Of course they do, but also, because they're not ontologically different. But also beyond that one, there is nothing that a government can do that will void your right to self-defense. There's nothing a government can do. Rather, that is a misplacing, that is a misinterpretation of this principle of liability, where when I choose to violate your self-sovereignty, I become liable for my own death. If I were to corrupt that concept, that is the only way that you can come to the conclusion. God, I'm at the fringe of my thought for the day. That is the only way that you can come to the conclusion by corrupting an otherwise true principle. It would be the only way you could come to the conclusion would be to corrupt an otherwise true principle, and the corruption of that principle, where it would be to corrupt the liability of the individual for their own death. Try to put it back together here. The liability of an individual bears liability for their own death when they engage in the harm against other people. When they attempt to murder somebody else, they become liable for their own death because that person has to act out in self-defense. If this is true, then we have to deal with the appropriateness of the scenario. There we get, and this is, and then from there we get into the difficult. We continue to move on to the difficulty of addressing appropriateness of force. But do not be mistaken. Do not be mistaken. There are those out there who seek to misguide you in making you doubt your right to self-defense so that they can, in your moment of doubt, take advantage of you, take advantage of your work, your labor, your life, your essence. Do not be mistaken that anyone who claims that you do not have a right to self-defense, that the accusation alone is not only worthy of suspect, but it is something dark. The idea that an individual doesn't have a right to self-defense by skin color would be racism. By existence would be probably a form of elitism, but we'll move on to there. But do not be surprised when people attack your right to self-defense. Do not be surprised at all, because those who wish to do you harm find frustration in the fact that you are solid in your belief in your right to defend yourself. That is always tempered morally by a greater obligation to do what is right rather than what is expedient. And that tempering force within you is your understanding, your commitment to doing what is right, not what is expedient. For doing what is right recognizes that if your motivations are off, you will bear moral culpability for it in this world or the next. That being the case, we're still doing that pre-order, but I want to leave you with that. I want to leave you with that today. Enjoy your evening. Go forth and conquer. Keep your hatchet sharp and your powder dry. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast, episode 84 on self-defense.